Welcome to the Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes of veteran mental health. I'm your host, Dwayne France. Let's get ready to make sure that your headspace and timing set correctly. Hey everybody, welcome to Headspace and Timing. If this is your first time listening, then thanks for checking us out. As many of you who serve know, the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal, is one of the greatest weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing isn't set right, however, it's just a huge chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my mission here, to raise awareness about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week we'll talk about different aspects of veteran mental health and interview mental health professionals that are working with veterans, service members, and their families around the country. All right, folks, thanks for joining us again for this episode of Headspace and Timing. I'm really excited to have this guest on. I've known Greg for, probably a couple years now, a little bit more than that. I am proud to call him a mentor and a friend. But I'd like to introduce everyone to Dr. Greg Frazier.
Thank you, Dwayne. It's great to be on with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you taking the time. Dr. Frazier's in Florida. I'm in Colorado. I assume both of our weather is beautiful, and because it just happens that way most of the time.
Exactly.
So, Greg, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and you know, military service, and then just a little bit of what you've done kind of since then, what you're doing now.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I served 3 tours in Vietnam, and since that's been many, many years ago now, I was concerned about the lack of resources that I saw that I needed myself that were not available, as well as a lot of the guys that were coming home from there. So my interest in there in veterans counseling and veterans issues started really back in 1973 when I came home. And it sort of culminated more recently when I started working with the National Board for Certified Counselors Foundation. And for those of you listening, that's the organization through which I actually met Dwayne. And the foundation has as one of its funding priorities veterans counseling needs, and the mission of the foundation is to bridge the gap in counseling and to bring strategic resources together to provide those needs for folks in our target populations. So since being with NBCC Foundation, I helped establish a couple of veterans counseling initiatives that provide free counseling to veterans who are perhaps on the waiting list for the VA, which is quite long, or have a reason that they don't want to approach the VA for counseling. And in my other life, I am a qualified parenting coordinator and a Florida Supreme Court certified family mediator, and I do forensic work with the courts. And being in a military-centric town like Jacksonville, a lot of my clients, I discovered, are veterans, and a lot of them are OEF and OIF, and they have come back, and the metaphor I used is they came back only partially, and their marriages broke up very quickly, and they ended up being court-ordered into parenting coordination with me. So one of the things that I've found that I am able to do that I think is important work is provide PTSD screening and resource referral for a lot of the men and women coming back who are dealing with or who have not been dealing rather with some of those issues.
So you're not busy at all. You don't. You got tons of free time on your hands.
Constantly.
Well, and obviously, and definitely, again, where I knew that, but just the opportunity to take some time out to talk a little bit, and really like to break some more of that up. The NBCC Foundation is focused on underserved populations. A lot of people may not consider veterans an underserved population when it comes to mental health, right? I mean, that's something that, well, isn't that what the VA takes care of? So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. One of the things that I found when we were establishing the Veterans Counseling Center here in Jacksonville was part of what I did was some of the fundraising for the center to get the program up and running. And I would find people constantly, people who are intelligent, well-educated, and have plenty of resources that would help with something in which they were interested. And over again, I'd hear when I would approach people about donating to the cause was the VA takes care of that. And so I found that I was constantly in a position of trying not to denigrate the great work that gets done by the VA on very limited resources. The practitioners that I know that work for the VA are dedicated, committed, passionate people, most of them veterans themselves. And instead of a normal caseload of 25 to 30 clients, they have 200 to 300. So there's no way that the VA will ever be able to meet the mental health needs within the veteran community.
And that's absolutely true. I mean, we've been having discussions, obviously, here in Colorado Springs, and I'm hearing a lot of people within the VA saying the same thing, that the need is so overwhelming that there has to be community partnerships. But it sounds like you had to do a lot of just education, community education about veteran mental health and the need that's out there.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there are a lot of people that don't understand what happens, particularly in the more recent wars with combat veterans. I go back. My father-in-law was one of Carlson's raiders, and he was one of the first people to set foot on Guadalcanal. And he told we got into some great conversations, and he said, I remember fondly coming home from the war. He was on a troop ship for 6 weeks, and they sat around, as we used to say, coking and smoking, and telling war stories and sort of debriefing one another. So by the time they got back to the States, they'd had some time to decompress. And you start with Vietnam and move forward, and combat veterans are in country one day and at home the next, and there's no transition. And I think back to the expression we used in Vietnam. We'd, rather than talking about coming home, we'd say we're going back to the world. And I think that was a key symbolic statement that fit not only back then, but would fit any combat veterans situation and experiences. Because what happened, I speak, of course, much more fluently about Vietnam. What happened is we ended up in a country where we didn't know the culture. Values were radically different from our values. We had experiences that we never would have had in our country. Things like, children with satchel bombs strapped onto them, children with weapons who were trying to kill us. And so in order to survive, you had to become a part of that craziness. One of the greatest depictions of that, I think, was the movie Apocalypse Now.
Right, yeah.
And at the end of that movie, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, God, that was a wasted 30 minutes in the end. What was that all about? What it was all about was a character who was unable to leave that cultural mindset and come back to what was normative for him.
Right.
So the choice was for him in that particular case to stay there. But the problem with that is, and I think this comes forward to current day veterans, there are a lot of men and women who come home from a combat situation who don't ever really fully make it home. They can't make the transition back into their normal lives and cultures anymore.
And I recognize that. I see the same thing. And even from what you were talking about, my first tour in Afghanistan, my second deployment, it was one of those where literally we got off a patrol, which we had a firefight, 3 hours before we ended the patrol, boots on ground, and I was actually on a plane leaving country like 6 hours later, and I was back in America. It was probably 2 or 3 days, just because of the transition. But it was that quick, and it was a very hard thing to just wrap your mind around. Now all of a sudden I can get even something as trivial as hamburger whenever I want kind of thing. But there's just this big, wide open space. And so I have heard that there was benefit to that decompression time. Much like coming up from a depth in the ocean, you need time to be able to decompress, oxygen and things like that. But there's a benefit to having some of the psychological decompression. One thing that I hear from a lot of people, though, is, well, be careful about, people tell me or respond to the writing, be careful about, talking too much about PTSD because you'll just perpetuate the stereotype that all vets are crazy and stuff like that. What would you say to them, Greg?
I'd say never mind. What I would say to them could not be on the podcast. But if I were in a rational mood when I heard somebody say that, I would say that is as inane as saying if we talk about pregnancy, everybody's going to get pregnant. We talk when we start having conversations about mental health. Many people retreat from those conversations into what I think for them is a safe place. And that safe place says, let's don't talk about it, and it'll go away. And the fact is, it won't go away. PTSD has been around since war has been around, and it's just been called by different names. Shell shock in World War I, World War II was battle fatigue and forward. And it wasn't really until 1982 when the Diagnostic Services Manual actually put it in as a diagnosis. So I think that's the kind of attitude that perpetuates stigma as well.
Yeah, I mean, I get that thing too. I mean, we do have to walk the balance between making sure that everyone who is in the community, there is a larger gap between those who have served and those who haven't. Everyone acknowledges that. But those that are in the community that want to, that live next to the veterans or work in the cubicle next to the veteran or what have you, for them, we can't not talk about it and reduce the stigma against it. It actually has to be discussed.
We had a young OEF veteran who went to work for a major department store chain. After he had experienced a period of about a year of homelessness, and everyone who started in the warehouse at the time he did with this particular store served 3 months in the warehouse, and then they put him in a more comfortable, a better job, and got promotions. And he got passed over group after group after group. So I had a conversation with the supervisor who told him that he'd be glad to talk with someone else about the problem. So I went in and talked to the supervisor, and he said, well, here's the problem. He told me that he has PTSD, and I don't want any of my other employees to get exposed to that and possibly catch it.
Oh, yeah. So it's
contagious. So it's contagious now too. Yeah. So back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier about community education. That's prime. I think that when people hear PTSD, largely thanks to some sensationalized media coverage of the rare case where somebody really goes off the deep end and has some violent behavior that affects many, many lives. That's not every veteran.
Right.
In fact, the population of veterans with PTSD who engage in such behavior as that after having a major mental health breakdown is minuscule compared to what the numbers are in the general population.
And I think that's really important for a lot of people to understand. I mean, it's an academic thing for when they see it on the TV, and let me donate to a cause and things like that. But just like with anything else in here, we're talking again about a misunderstood, underserved population of and really it's a type of discrimination, and that's been going on with mental health in general, of course, in the country for a very long time. But veterans are starting to experience that now too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So your work, and you said that you had established a veteran counseling initiative there in Jacksonville for a while.
Correct.
So what was that like, getting it up off the ground? I know you and I have had some conversations about that, but what was your experience about trying to establish a veteran-specific mental health counseling initiative in a big city like Jacksonville?
I think there were a number of challenges, and one of the basic challenges was people believing that it was not needed because the VA was able to provide the services that we were talking about providing. The homeless center for the veterans was already in existence, and they had done a great job of helping people transition into jobs post discharge. But the problem was there was a lot of recidivism. So these guys that had been off the street and living in the center for, I'll say, a year on the average, we were finding they were coming back to the center because the one thing that wasn't being addressed were the mental health needs.
Right.
So we tried to make some inroads with the VA, and the VA in this area was so overburdened that they were almost apologetic about the fact that there was not much they could do to address the problems unless things got really escalated, and that dealt with one-on-one situation with a specific veteran, and while ignoring the needs of others. So the education was challenging. We did have some resistance from some of the practitioners in the VA who felt like we were being critical of them, or that we were trying to take their jobs away from them. And we met with a few of them and assured them that there's plenty of work out there for all of us.
Right. Yeah.
Every one of us. So again, funding was an issue. But one of the things that struck me and that really surprised me more than anything was the lack of cohesion among veterans organizations that are nationally known. Now, what I mean by that is we had at that time, and I suspect it's probably even multiplied by then, we had 3 separate, distinct veterans oversight committees.
In the community.
In the community.
Right.
So these were organizations that said, okay, let's coordinate what we're doing and make sure that our veterans have what they need. And it was a wonderful idea the first time. The second time, maybe not so much. And the third time, even less so. So now we've got 3 organizations who are more concerned about who's going to align with them than they are about who's going to be serving the veterans. Within all of those groups, as we see in all areas of life, there was competition and turf wars. You know, we want to be the ones to sponsor this, not you. And it was quite a challenge. Then the other piece that we ran into that was actually very positive was Veterans Treatment Court had just gotten off the ground about the same time we were trying to introduce the mental health counseling program for the veteran community, and we were able to work very closely with them and provide the services that were needed for those veterans who had run up against the criminal justice system.
I mean, and that's I think that's probably common. I do recognize some similarities between the work that we're doing in here in Colorado and other providers that I've talked to in other areas where it's a good idea, but it has to be going against and I'm choosing my words carefully here, but entrenched entities or people that have their experience. I was actually talking to a colleague the other day for breakfast, and she had said that in her town, she just moved to another large city, not going to be named, but there was one or two particular individuals who were essentially the veteran godfathers of that. And that she felt as though, we have to kiss the ring and we have to serve along. I mean, even if it were not something, if the method of operation is not as good as it possibly can be, but we still have to go along to get along, and that can be really challenging when people are just trying to do well for veterans, to do good work.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the program itself, how is it set up as far as a counseling program? What kind of impact did it have on the community? But about the program itself.
Well, we started with a single counselor who was also a qualified clinical supervisor, and we recruited through the local university, the University of North Florida, and their clinical mental health counseling program. We recruited 4 interns who were interested in working with veterans population post-graduation and also as their internships. So we applied and became a certified internship site through the University of North Florida. And I don't know who had more effect on whom. I don't know whether the veterans got more out of the interns or the interns' lives were being enriched by the veterans' stories, and I think it was probably a really good, healthy combination of the two. So we established some volunteer groups, some group work, because oftentimes that will be the vehicle through which we can attract, if you will, a veteran into individual therapy, is sharing some of the experiences in a group setting. So we would have what would have traditionally been called anger management, perhaps, in a group.
Right.
We would give it an alternative name, but give the veterans an opportunity to talk about what their triggers were for angry episodes that they might have, what their triggers were that would bring on depression, and what relational problems they had, and so on. So the groups really were very helpful in making the veterans feel comfortable in an environment that contrasts greatly with the active duty model of you don't talk about any problems with mental health if you want to save your career or get promoted.
So at what point, when did your initiative start there in Jacksonville?
This was 3 years ago.
Okay, so about 13, 14, and that was really, that was after a lot of the surges, but that was still a very high op tempo for both theaters. So you did see a lot of service members. And so it's not like 2002, 2003, the wave hadn't hit yet, but this was when it was a pretty big crisis.
Right. And these guys were, that we ended up seeing at the center, were guys that had completely fallen through the cracks. So they came home. For many of them, they had severe relationship issues, not just spousal issues, but issues with their parents, issue with other family members, and they kind of burned them out because nobody knew what they needed, nobody knew what was going on. All they knew is they came home and they weren't who they used to be. So there were few to any resources for them outside of the VA, and frankly, many of them didn't even realize they had access to the VA.
Right.
So part of what we would do is establish a relationship with the VA for health care, which is a little bit faster than behavioral health care. And so we managed to catch them after really they had fallen through the cracks. There was no veteran safety net in the area at that time. So we had guys that had been living in abandoned buildings. We had one guy who had lived in a hospital for a number of months, and he would just figure out where to hide at night and get up in the morning, take a shower, and go out and try to find a little work here and there.
You can never underestimate the resourcefulness of a veteran.
No, sir. And that's another. I mean, that's a really good point too, Dwayne, because when we think about employment, when we think about what some of the things I was talking about a little earlier about the guy who his supervisor was afraid he was going to catch PTSD or give it to his other employees, people need to understand too that when somebody comes out of the military, they have been in a highly disciplined, structured environment for anywhere from 2 to however many years. And so that oftentimes that training is going to kick in. So they won't demonstrate some of the behaviors that would be more obvious perhaps to someone who had not had that experience of being in the military.
No, sure, absolutely. I mean, it's what I tell veterans and people all the time. It's as much of a culture. You know, you and I, we spent time in the military as if we went to go live in Europe for a period of time, and became acculturated to that. You know, maybe we still spoke the same language. We went to Ireland or Germany, but then we come back here and we're familiar with a different culture.
Yes.
Even when you just said, I know a couple of guys, probably some of my co-hosts on this podcast would be like, man, that's a great idea to go live in a hospital. I'm going to try it out.
Yeah.
Right? That's you know, they're like, it's just a challenge for me. Man, why didn't I think of that? Just to let everybody know in the audience, we are not endorsing that you use the hospital as a temporary shelter.
I was thinking about a cruise ship, maybe.
Maybe could, you know, just a stowaway, just to, you know, you don't work here? No. But yeah, so I mean that's exactly the thing, is that's the kind of thing that you know a veteran has different experiences. Anyone would have different experiences. You know, if you grew up in you know, if, for example, you know, people say, oh, where you're from? I'm from Missouri. Oh, you cows? And no, I'm from St. Louis. Totally different type of Missouri, because I'm a city guy. I'm not what you would normally think that someone from Missouri, and it does have to do with a different type of background. And I think not a lot of veterans understand that themselves either, how they
Exactly.
their cultural connection to the military.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's helpful even to be able to help them understand that. And that's one of my things. And you know, if you believe the same, it's that mental health is not about fixing what's wrong with you. You're talking about counseling. Mental health counseling is not about fixing something that's broken, but it's helping you become a better version of yourself. It's a wellness thing instead of an illness.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
Absolutely.
that's a misconception a lot of veterans have. When they think about therapy, it's Freud on the couch. You're going to throw me a bunch of pills, but it's not really like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, other than, I mean, there's some of those community barriers, but what are some of the other challenges that you see that really kind of get in the way of veteran mental health, either from an individual standpoint or maybe a community standpoint?
You know, I think back on this one young vet who had just come home from Afghanistan, and when they were doing some of his transitional work with their group, he said there were about 400 people in this auditorium, and he said this officer got up in front of the group, and he said, "All right, raise your hand if you've ever felt any of this stuff that I'm getting ready to read to you." And he read the diagnostic criteria for PTSD out of the DSM-4. Now, how many people do you think raised their hand?
Right.
So now everybody's cleared. We have no symptoms of PTSD. Go home, be blessed, go along your way. So part of what we fight is the continuing culture of the active duty military, where the stigma against seeking any kind of behavioral health assistance is frowned upon. The medical care system is even there's a special provider that is designed by active duty military where you don't go for counseling, you just go to talk a little bit. And if the counselor decides you are going to be diagnosed, they have to refer back to the command for the command to make the referral to a therapist. So that's just because, frankly, the people there are the concern at the officer level oftentimes, I think, is operational readiness, and they think that anybody who has had any sort of mental health issue is no longer operational ready, so they need to just go home. So I think we start with that level of stigma, and they come out of the military, and if they are VA eligible, then they find roadblocks there. So when you get just a simple comparison of it takes me 30 days to get an appointment for my shoulder that's hurting versus 120 days to get an appointment for mental health intake, that speaks loudly to somebody, I think, that is already maybe having to operate under.
And I think that's a lot of the idea of that external stigma that has been internalized, and the veterans take that out from their service. A lot of the and even some of the senior leaders I talk to with the activity at the senior levels, that seems to be changing. There's a lot more understanding around mental health concerns, but it's really at that base level, the squad leader, the team leader, the team chief, the section chief, that stigma still stands strong. Yeah, and they have more influence over, more daily influence rather than the lieutenant commander or full bird colonel.
Sure, absolutely.
And so I think that. And of course, the barriers that are coming along with the VA, and again, you communicate with the VA, I communicate with the VA on a daily basis, and of course, everybody's trying to, and they do say, things are changing, and we're doing a lot of different things, but how can community providers, in your experience, come alongside and provide support for the VA? Because a lot of these veterans don't have TRICARE, for example, or they simply can't pay for their own services.
Right. I think that the answer to that is we have to multiply the number of counselors who are culturally competent for working with veterans. And I think coming along with that is the realization that, forget about the VA for a minute, we are so short nationwide in the number of mental health counselors that are needed to provide adequate care for the entire population of Americans, that it becomes even more of a challenge when you narrow that down to a specific target population like veterans. But I think we need to provide scholarships and other funding that will help develop these counselors, and develop them. By develop them, I mean help them with their education. It's a very expensive process, and help them with mentorship and training as they move out into the world and begin to do what their hearts are telling them to do, which is counsel with veterans. So I think at the center of the issue is going to be that multiplication. We've got 2 mental health counseling university programs here in Jacksonville. There are 3, maybe 4 now active cohorts. So we're talking 60, 75 people. And out of them, maybe 10% might be focused on providing services for veterans.
Yeah, and you mentioned that earlier, and even going back to that first cohort, and I'd meant to ask that before, but out of those first 4 interns, Were any of them veterans? Were any of them had any military background?
Yes, two of the four had military background. The other two had family members whose lives had been adversely affected by war.
Because that's one of the things that I think that I know that I hear often, others hear often, is veterans will say, well, I'm not going to go talk to anybody who hasn't been there. I'm not going to go talk to someone who's not a veteran and stuff like that. And as you very clearly mentioned, there's not enough of, like you or I, veterans who are also mental health professionals. There's not enough of us in the mental health professional community for that to be a requirement. I'm personally not of the opinion that someone must be a veteran to be able to counsel veterans, or even to be able to counsel them most effectively. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree 100%. It kind of goes back to the old argument. Some of the finest marriage counselors I've ever known have been Catholic priests. And there was always an argument that how can a priest who can't get married and has never had a family know anything about family dynamics? Well, that's what our universities and colleges are for, to teach those skills. And I think the underlying skill set that's needed for providing effective or the underlying foundational skill set, I would say, for providing effective counseling to any group, but most specifically our topic of veterans, is that of compassion.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the desire to want to learn about veterans, I mean, this is some of the challenge that I think I've seen across many communities is there's a professional counselor who says, oh, I know trauma, so therefore I must also be able to work with veterans because I know trauma. And that's not exactly a one-to-one connection, but a desire to understand on a deeper level what the cultural experience of a veteran is, as opposed to just, well, I work with vehicle crash survivors, and so I know PTSD.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that. I think that one of the differences for me is oftentimes with combat veterans, it's more of a persistent trauma, and there have been a lot of studies about the effects that persistent trauma has over a single-time trauma in somebody's lives, and what that does in terms of conditioning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that just the constant exposure to that, I mean, and perhaps not even just trauma, but constant stress. I mean, obviously, neurologically, biologically, there's things there too. Now, I did want to, I do like to talk to everyone, or I don't like to talk to everyone about this because of the subject matter, but there's few challenges that are more significant in our veteran community than the epidemic of veteran suicide. It's insidious. We know, the studies a couple years ago said 22. Now it's down to 20. But again, that's just an algorithm, an approximation. It's just the veteran suicide epidemic. Even one is too much. How can we as mental health professionals make an impact on the epidemic of veteran suicide?
Yeah, that is probably the question for today. I think what happens with a lot of the guys, if you even get to find out what a case study would be of someone who was a veteran who came home and within 2 years or 20 years committed suicide, I think it's difficult to place a template over that and say, if we only did this, then this would be the result. Mm. I think attention is one thing. I go back to the multiplication of it's a multi-pronged approach, the multiplication of the number of counselors, the multiplication of the number of counselors who are passionate about working with veterans, the community education piece, which hopefully will always be geared toward reducing initially and then hopefully someday eliminating stigma. The idea that families oftentimes feel helpless, and families need to be empowered to reach out and say, my husband, my wife, my brother, my sister, my son, my daughter is having these problems that I don't understand, and have the family be a vehicle to try to help them get the help that they need.
But even then, and I think I saw a recent article where even the caregivers are increasingly isolated because their community, they're not sure of what the resources are, and so they feel as though no one else is going through this, and it goes back to that same the impact of the stigma of silence.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's really what we're trying to do here as far as getting the word out to say, look, there's tons of places out here. I was reading or writing one of my blogs, and I did a Google search just for veteran suicide help, and within 0.6 seconds there were millions in hits, right? It's out there, and then that goes back to that internal stigma of, at that point of crisis, does that veteran or does that community or family member know that there's resources in the community? And how do we break that? How do we get the message out? Because that's where I feel like sometimes we as mental health professionals might be spinning our wheels.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I think is often overlooked is the ability of a mental health counselor to get a message out to the community through organizations like the Rotary Club. Rotary Club, having been a Rotarian at one point in my life, and having been tasked as one of the newer ones at that particular point in my life with being in charge of program, because nobody wants to do that. Right. And they're desperate to find people who will come in and speak for 15 minutes. And I can promise you that if any counselor were to call any Rotary Club and ask them if they had a meeting that they could come and speak, the answer would be yes. So civic organizations, any opportunity that presents itself to be an ambassador for veterans' needs and resources that are available.
But I think that's also a challenge with our industry, is we're typically, we know what we do works. It works behind closed doors. We don't really talk about it. We can't tell you specifics, of course, because it's confidential and things like that. But we seem to be so convinced of the quality of our product that why wouldn't people just come in and sit down and tell us their secrets?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I've seen with some colleagues is they're not comfortable doing that. They're not comfortable getting up and talking about, not that they're ashamed of what they do. They're very proud and passionate about what they do, but the outreach, and even for yourself coming on a podcast and talking about these things, sometimes we as an industry do ourselves a disservice. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is also the work ethic that we have.
Yes, true.
I'm thinking right now, here I am on a podcast with you and my dear wife, who actually is the manager and owner of our practice, is going to be in her office for another hour and a half seeing clients. Right. And she started at 8 o'clock this morning. We grabbed lunch in passing over about 30 minutes. So by the time a counselor puts in a week's worth of work, it's time to hit the sofa or hit the beach or walk a trail or something. So I think that's another thing that happens. We have to carve out times in our lives to say, okay, this is important. This is an important time for me to take the opportunity to speak out and share about something that I might be an expert about.
And that's something, folks, every time I talk to Dr. Greg Frazier, I learned something. That was a learning point for me. I think when you and I sat down for breakfast and you said that I still have a lot of edges, right? Another one of my edges was just knocked off, because you're exactly right. I think about my colleagues, and they're very, very dedicated to what they do, and they have a large caseload. And so it is an opportunity of, it's really more a bird in the hand versus two potential birds in the bush. I can spend an hour talking to a client that really needs my help. Not that it's egotistical and myself-based, but but I have a skill set that can help a veteran. So I'm going to work with the veteran who needs my help rather than spending time talking to a bunch of people, which may or may not turn into something.
Right, right.
No, that's great. Always learn something. I always do. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate wherever that came from.
But it makes total sense, and you're exactly right. And we, we get caught up in what we think should or should not be done, or could or couldn't be done. But I do have the gracious support, not just from my employer and obviously the NBCC Foundation. I guess I should have made that declaration earlier. I am actually a grantee recipient of the NBCC Foundation, but this isn't part of that. So don't want to. They are a sponsor of the work that I'm doing in Colorado Springs, not of this podcast. But even the benefit of the Jay and of Bennett and Eddie, who are hosting the podcast, to be able to allow us to use this time to talk about veteran mental health, and that's not typical. Not all in the profession have that ability. So that's great.
Absolutely.
So one of the closing questions I like to ask is, if you have a veteran or somebody listens to this and they shoot you an email and they be like, what's the point? Why do I even need to work with a counselor? Why would it, what good would it do me? What would you say to them?
I think I would tell them a little bit about my own story. As everyone knows who's in the kind of mental health business, the diagnosis of PTSD didn't come along till 1982. And I came home a decade earlier than that.
So you didn't have PTSD, right?
Yeah, right.
It wasn't
it did exist. And I went from pillar to post looking for resources for somebody who could tell me why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And the person who ultimately was able to initially snag my attention was not a veteran, but he was someone who cared passionately about what he was seeing among veterans who were coming home from Vietnam. So I would say that the wisest person is the one who will seek out someone who can walk a journey with them. When we try to do it alone, the only feedback we get comes from a mirror. And it's so helpful to have a live human being sitting across from you who really does care about what's going on in your life to walk that journey with you.
No, that's great. It's the idea of without reaching out, you're just going to get an echo chamber, and
right.
It's just going to respond back to you. No, that's I mean, and I agree. I whenever I am confronted with that question, I say, well, how's life working for you now? Is it as good as it could possibly be? And that's some great thoughts. So is there any other questions that I didn't ask that you think maybe I should have, or something that you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I think I sneaked all that in, Dwayne.
you worked it in spite of my questions, is what you're telling me. That's great.
No, your questions were very stimulating to me. As I said offline to you, they really made me think back more years than I even care to count. And whenever I reflect, I find that I always come up with some new insight.
Well, that's
so
great.
Thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that too. So if some of our listeners, especially maybe those in Florida, or some mental health professionals who are interested in learning more about the NBCC Foundation, how can they get a hold of you? Website perhaps, or email, Twitter? I don't know if that's what you do.
Sure. The easiest way it would be to go to the website, and it is nbccf.org. That's National Board for Certified Counselors Foundation.org, or November Bravo Charlie Charlie Foxtrot.org.
No, that's and definitely you will find Dr. Greg Frazier and his contact information there. Congratulations, I hear, for the NBCC itself. I just saw the big news about the portability
Yes.
that just recently happened. Obviously, this is a little bit not for our broad listeners, but for those of us in the profession, that's huge. And so just extending my thanks to you and the NBCC team that really is doing a lot for that.
Thank you.
So that'll wrap it up here for the Headspace and Timing podcast, folks. Dr. Frazier, again, it's always great when I am able to steal some of your time, but especially thankful that you were able to spend some time to get this out to the audience.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.